Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this conversation on virtual exchange. This podcast series grows out of the forthcoming Handbook of Using Virtual Exchange Across Disciplines, Building Global Citizens from Home, which will be published by Springer in April 2026. The handbook brings together educators from a wide range of disciplines who are exploring how virtual exchange is reshaping teaching, learning, and collaboration across borders. Sometimes this work unfolds smoothly. At other times, it is demanding and complex, but it is often transformative. My name is Robert Steele. I'm a professor at DePaul University in Chicago, and I serve as the art section editor for the handbook. One of the great privileges of working on this volume has been seeing how creative disciplines have embraced virtual exchange not simply as a logistical solution during crisis, but as a reimagining of pedagogy itself. Nowhere is that more evident than in documentary filmmaking, where questions of voice, authorship, ethics, and global citizenship are central to the craft. Today, I'm truly pleased to be joined by Professor Pablo Frasconi and Professor Li Yong, co-authors of the chapter The U.S. and China Global Cities Symphony, Creating Collaboratory Documentary Films During a Time of Crisis. In this chapter, they reflect on the reinvention of a long-running in-person documentary exchange program into a fully virtual, transnational collaboration during the COVID-19 pandemic. What emerges is not simply a story of adaptation, but a rethinking of documentary form, pedagogy, empathy, and global citizenship under extraordinary pressure. So welcome, Li and Pablo. Please introduce yourselves, your titles, and your institutions. Let's start with Li.
那在这一个播客系列当中呢，我们今天欢迎李教授和 Pablo 教授一起来进行一个介绍他们的章节，然后他们这一个章节呢是关于在疫情期间如何将一个原本长期线下的纪录片交流项目转变成一个完全线上的跨国协作式的项目。这个不只是我们为了适应而改变，而是在巨大的压力下重新思考纪录片形式、教学方法、同理心以及全球公民身份。那现在我们先欢迎李教授和 Pablo 教授，请你们向大家介绍一下你们自己。
OK，Thank you。我叫李勇，来自中国北京的中国传媒大学戏剧影视学院。感谢张教授帮我来做翻译，谢谢。
Thank you. My name is Li Yong. I'm from the School of Drama, Film and Television at the Communication University of China in Beijing. I would like to thank Professor Zhang for helping me with the translation. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Pablo Frasconi, and I'm a professor of practice at School of Cinematic Arts at USC in Los Angeles. I'm also the director of graduate production, and I teach editing, teach creating poetic cinema, and I teach nature design and media.
And I'd also like to introduce Professor Chi Chang of SUNY Brockport, who will serve as interpreter for today's conversation. Dr. Chang is a full professor of special education whose work focuses on children with disabilities, culturally and linguistically diverse families, and the scholarship of teaching and learning. She has published extensively, presenting nationally and internationally, and has received multiple SUNY awards for excellence in teaching and online learning.
那让我们欢迎来自中国北京传媒大学的李勇教授，和来自美国加州洛杉矶大学的Pablo 教授。然后今天担任翻译的是纽约州立大学 Brockport 分校的张杰教授。谢谢大家。
I'd like to turn now to your chapter and to what virtual exchange made possible in this remarkable collaboration.
那现在我们就进入主题，我想请两位教授来聊聊你们的章节，然后聊聊虚拟交流如何让这一个跨国合作成为可能。
So based on your chapter, what impact did virtual exchange have on the subject matter for your course?
Usually the collaboration between our two nations in this exchange program involved half of the students being the hosts and the other half being the guests, with the hosts leading the way in accessibility of subjects, content, perspectives, conventions, and traditions. Without this direct person-to-person contact, each collaborator was prompted to first discover their subject matter on their own, to go as deep into research and point of view that time and energy would allow, and then compare the process online with their collaborator. This meant that the subject matter became inclusive of nations and perspectives, one of comparison, discovering the similarities and contrasts between the collaborators. This inspired the cross-cutting of two or more stories across distances and cultures to create a new story.
首先回答第一个问题，根据本章内容，虚拟交流对你的课程主题产生了什么影响？之前采用线下真实交流授讲的时候呢，我的学生们可以合作在同一个地方完成同一个作品。采用虚拟交流的授课方法以后呢，我们不得不让2位同学身处各自的国家，各自进行拍摄，并且还要能将他们各自拍摄的影片素材剪辑成为同一个作品。这很明显地增加了我们课程中设置影片主题的难度，同时也影响了我们如何架构整个教学过程。如果将这一难度具体化的说出来，就是寻找相似性，在2个国家、2种不同文化之间，在某些问题上呈现出的相似性是相对比较困难的。
First, I would like to respond to the first question. Based on your chapter, what impact did virtual exchange have on the subject matter of your course? Previously, when I used in-person instruction with face-to-face interactions, my students were able to collaborate at the same location and complete one project together. After adopting the virtual exchange approach, however, we had to ask 2 students to film separately in their own countries and then edit the footage they have recorded into one final project. This has clearly increased the difficulty of setting themes for the film and has also impacted on how we structure the overall teaching process. More specifically, this challenge lies in identifying similarities. It is relatively difficult to find common ground on certain issues between 2 different cultures across 2 countries.
What would have been missed in teaching about your discipline if virtual exchange were not included in this project?
Because participants had time to reflect and consider rather than only document, virtual exchange deepened the filmmakers' perspectives, which inspired deeper emotional content than simple documentation. The resulting work was more resonant than in-person work. Often we think of online communication as a diversion from reality. In this case, the virtual aspect became the authentic, verifiable truth.
下面回答第2个问题。如果课程中没有包含虚拟交流，在教授你的学科时会错过哪些内容或经验？如果课程不是采用虚拟交流手段来进行，而是回到最开始的线下面对面授课的方式，我认为最有可能错过的内容，当然就是学生们这种跨地区拍摄内容的结合。这其实更可能是我们这种国际合作教学最值得推广的方式。在不同文化中寻找相似性，无疑是一个非常有价值且非常有吸引力的课题。另外，如果不采用虚拟交流方式，当然就会缺失线上与学生交流的经验。线上交流某种程度上要求师生之间以及合作的学生之间有更加深入的互动。这种方式能让一个人冷静下来，认真仔细地去思考对方的问题和想法，只有这样才能达到合作主题上的统一。这其中充满了挑战，但依据成功。
Next, I will respond to the second question. What would have been missed in teaching your discipline if virtual exchange had not been included? If the course was not taught through virtual exchange, but instead through a traditional in-person teaching model, the most significant loss would be students' experience of integrating filming conducted across regions. In fact, this kind of cross-regional integration may be one of the most valuable aspects of international collaborative teaching, which should be promoted. It is undoubtedly a highly valuable and interesting topic to explore similarities across different cultures. In addition, without virtual exchange, we would lose the experience of online interactions with the students. To some extent, online communication requires deeper interaction between teachers and students, as well as among students. This mode of communication allows individuals to slow down and thoughtfully consider others' questions and ideas. Only through this process can we reach consensus around a shared collaborative theme. This process is full of challenges.
And the question is, you begin by describing the pandemic as an unprecedented convergence of health crisis, technological innovation, and adaptive resilience. When did you realize that moving the Global City Symphony online was not just a temporary solution, but a fundamental transformation of the program?
那让我们从李教授先开始你们在文章的一开头提到过，疫情把健康危机、技术创新和适应性、韧性都聚集在一起。那你们从什么时候开始意识到，把全球城市交响曲这样一个搬到线上，已经不只是暂时的应对，而是整个项目的一个根本性转变？李教授。
OK，就是随着疫情的到来呢，这个给整个社会造成了非常深远的影响，尤其是在人们的沟通交流的过程中，我们本来和这个南加大这个城市交响的项目呢，一直是在线下举行的，那么其实呢，就是一年在美国，一年在中国，交替进行。那么这个目的呢，是通过线下的这种比较亲密的接触呢，让中美两方的学生呢能够有深度的交流合作啊。但是呢，随着疫情的到来呢，这种形式已经变得不可能了。那么随着这个要推进这个项目的过程中呢，我们意识到呢，这个虚拟的形式是一个唯一的解决的办法。那么随着这个虚拟形式的展开呢，那么其实我们在逐渐的过程中才发现呢，其实它也带来了一些意想不到的优势。
Because of the global pandemic, it impacted negatively a lot of different aspects in our lives, including the studies. And our university has had already been communicated and established the communication with Professor Pablo's project, like long before the pandemic. It was in person 1 year. The collaboration happened, the visit happened in the United States, and in another year it happened in China. So every year we replace the place, and through this way, the students can get into collaboration in depth, and they communicated in person. However, because of the pandemic, it became impossible for students to get in touch in person. And we have to find another new innovative way to continue our collaboration. Because of that, we found that virtual exchange became the only solution for us to continue our collaboration. And also, through the continuation of the collaboration through virtual exchange, we found some unexpected benefits due to virtual exchange.
比如说之前呢，中国的学生到美国去拍摄，那么只有一周，甚至更短的时间去熟悉这样一个环境啊，包括当地的这个人文的这个主题啊。那么实际上呢，这样的做出的纪录片呢，往往容易它的深度不够，对吧？那么现在随着这个由于这个虚拟手段的这个展开，那么中美两方的学生可以在各自的国家按照同一个主题去构建故事的时候呢。那么他们对于当地文化和当地的这个叙事故事的理解要更加深刻的多。那么这样结构出来的纪录片呢，它可能在它的意义和深度上要更加有优势。
In the past, when students met in person, they only spend about 1 week, sometimes even shorter time to get familiar with the local environment. For example, the Chinese students only came to the US for 1 week or shorter. Thus, the documentary product was not as in depth as we expected. However, because of the virtual exchange, the United States and the Chinese students can worked on the same project, shared topic, and they can learn each other's local culture in depth, and that helped their structure and find the meaning of their documentary films, so that the product will be even more meaningful and impactful.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Pablo, let's throw the question to you.
谢谢。那谢谢李教授的介绍。那下一个问题呢是Pablo 教授可以回答一下。
This program had existed since 2005, and every other year, either 8 students from USC or 8 students from the Communications University of China in Beijing came to the other school to collaborate and to create short documentaries over a 7-week period. And in 2018, we had been at CUC. At 2019, we were at USC. And then in 2020, we had planned to go back to Beijing for the program. And then as the year began, I started inquiring about travel and restrictions, about COVID restrictions. At the same time, USC began to try to figure out how it was going to continue teaching filmmaking if nobody could see anybody in the same place. So we thought we were going to go ahead, and I even considered going to a smaller town, thinking that might be safer for us not to be in Beijing because of the population, but I was told no, when COVID is under control, it'll be first in the big cities. So in March, USC shut down in-person classes, and we had to figure out what we were going to do with the global exchange. And I talked to some of the founders and some of the other administrators involved, and we shut it down. We figured we couldn't move forward. There were some growing restrictions on travel between US and China. The first Trump administration had decided to call COVID-19 the Chinese virus. So it became a very difficult period. And then what I saw was, towards the middle of the spring semester, was that students at USC who were having to remain in isolation were still making terrific movies. They couldn't work with actors in person. They couldn't do documentaries in person. It all had to be done virtually. And so when I saw that work, I thought, well, wait a minute, why don't we continue with the global exchange as a virtual exchange? And I consulted with Mark Harris, who was one of the founders of the program, 3-time Academy Award-winning documentary filmmaker, and consulted with our benefactor, Stephen Lesser, who's since passed away, and the chair at the time, Michael Fink, and we decided to propose it to CUC as a virtual program. And they bit that idea. They said, let's try it. And we began to plan to figure out how we were going to do this.
You write that the collaboration between the United States and China during this period was an act of hope and humanity, especially amid rising nationalism, mistrust, anti-Asian violence. And we'll start with Pablo on this one. How conscious were you that the workshop itself had become a counter-narrative to that geopolitical climate?
Well, I've been a documentary filmmaker for most of my life, since a teenager. So to me, counter narratives are in my blood. And I value freedom of speech, and I value the ability of all of us to have access to media. And I think this period of the democratization and convergence media that's all around us right now means that more people can get involved and to put their ideas and opinions, and as you call them, counter narratives, on the screen for others to view. So what I initially thought was a crisis turned into a possible opportunity for some collaboration that would not otherwise happen, and perhaps even some freedom of expression that might not otherwise happen.
A core principle of the workshop was that no student could work independently. Every film had to be co-created by partners from both nations. Why was that requirement so essential to the philosophy of the program?
那这个问题是问李教授第三个问题，就是 Robert 他说他有可能就是这个问题的序列会有变动，然后你们两个就是谁想回答都可以回答。然后这个问题第三个问题呢，他想先问李教授，在研讨会里面有一个很重要的决定，一个很重要的规定，就是说学生不能独立工作，每个影片呢必须是由两国学生共同完成的。为什么您觉得这一点对于你们的教学理念是非常关键的？
因为我们这个项目呢叫城市交响呢，它的核心原则就是不能独立完成，就是要加强两国学生的充分的交流，就围绕着同样一个这个影片的主题来做合作。如果是单独去完成的话呢，它就背离了这样一个基本的原则嘛。而且我们这样的设立这个项目的这样一个原则呢，它是有非常积极的意义的，就是想充分加强两国学生在这个文化和这个做片子这个方面的一个真正深度的交流。
So the title of the project is the Global City Symphony, and this cannot be independently produced by any one of the students, so that the students are required to communicate with each other and deepen the understanding among each other and deepen the final product. So this is the core principle of this project. So the collaboration is essential to this project.
And Pablo, I want to throw the next question to you. In the industrial cycle, students began with very different local stories, yet ultimately unified them through a shared meditation on industrialization and the passage of time. How do you guide students from surface comparison towards deeper conceptual integration?
Well, I know that the cultural norm for what is a documentary is that you are photographing things that are happening outside of yourself. It's an interesting facade within which to consider documentary, but it is as much an internal journey to figure out how you feel about the material that you're capturing, so that the students' relationship to their hometowns was what I encouraged them to research and to get in touch with. And once they found that emotional center, then it was a question of them sharing that with each other and finding some core that could unify their two stories. They couldn't imagine two more different cultures collaborating. Chinese is an ancient culture and the US is relatively young. And at the same time, there are some shared values, which I was not familiar with because I was brought up mid-century in the US. But some of those shared values are about the importance of family, the importance of home, the arts and culture and education. And once we frame that with our students, they begin to invest as an artist invests in the creation of their work. And that's where the material, the film, begins to have its own life.
And let's move on to another film, and this question is for Lee. In Two Grandchildren, the filmmakers moved beyond the shared fact of religious faith and instead centered the film on love, vulnerability, and quiet resilience. What does that example reveal about how you teach students to find emotional universality without flattening cultural differences?
那这个问题是给李教授的。在《两个孙辈》这个纪录片里面，学生们并没有停留在简单的这个宗教信仰这个共同点，而是把故事聚集在爱、脆弱和沉静的韧性上面。这个例子对于你们来说，如何教育学生在不抹平文化差异的前提下，如何引导他们找到情感上的普遍性？
OK，因为在刚才我们讲到这个城市交响项目的核心呢，是加强两国学生呢，在纪录片的制作方面的合作。那么其实有一个它更深层的目的是加强他们对于双方文化的理解，在这个理解的基础上，找到人类的普世价值和它的共同的这个有益的这种信仰吧。那么在这样的个关于祖辈的关于那两个孙辈的纪录片里头呢，他们的信仰不同，他们对这个很多问题的认知不同，但是他们对于家人的爱，他们的亲情是普世的，是共同的。所以说呢，我们在制作这个片子的时候呢，也有意的想让两国的学生呢，在聚焦各自的亲人的情感的同时呢，找到这其中的共性。那么其实这样一个引导的方式，也恰好是这个项目本身的宗旨所在。
So the core of the project, the Global City Symphony, is collaboration. And the purpose is to help students develop understanding of the culture and deepen their understanding of cultures. And some shared values all human beings will share, and also the faith. In this documentary, the Two Grandchildren project, even though the students hold different faiths, the commonality is that they shared the love, family value, and also their care for their family members. So we would like to focus on some common values in spite of the differences among the students, like how they had different faiths, etc. So it comes back to the core value of our project regarding the collaboration.
Yeah, and I have to say, for me as a teacher that teaches highly collaborative work, virtual exchanges have done such a great job in helping me teach how to collaborate. I don't think we have that inherently in a lot of our courses. We put students together and so on, but this takes it to another whole level. And Pablo, I'd like to shift now from structure to something more human and relational. Your section on empathy is especially rich. You draw on Brené Brown, neuroscience, and parallel concepts in Chinese language and philosophy. How did empathy function as a working method in the classroom and in the edit room, not just as a theme within the film?
Empathy is feeling together. And everything in cinema follows that guideline. It's that you want the audience to feel what's on the screen. You want the audience to feel what other people are feeling. And when you're collaborating in the creation of film, you all have to feel what each other are feeling at that moment. Roger Ebert famously said that movies are a machine that creates empathy. And that's so true with documentaries because you're frequently capturing moments in people's lives that are not only joyous and celebratory, but also traumatic. And in the case of COVID, there were millions of people lost on the planet. And that meant that neighbors had a different view of each other. I got to know my neighbors in ways that I never had before. We were in and out of each other's houses, sitting in backyards, having conversations. The same thing happened while we were making these movies. And so we all felt more intensely how important the relationship is among all the folks involved. This is not part of everyday modern life. In fact, I could argue that a lot of modern life is isolating people, and a lot of making films is siloed, where the crafts within them are not communicating with each other. They're contributing to the manufacture of something. That was not the case in this virtual exchange. There was an enormous amount of understanding and feeling and empathy for all the folks, subjects, filmmakers, audience involved.
In your discussion of disciplinary considerations, you argue that when time and space are fractured by distance and time zones, emotion must take precedence in editing. Drawing on Walter Murch's rule of six, did this transnational structure push students to organize their films around emotional truth rather than spatial or chronological continuity?
那这个是问的李教授，第7个问题，就是在谈到学科的特性的时候，您谈到当时空被距离和时差相隔开的时候，情感在剪辑当中必须是优先考虑的。那结合这个6法则，这种跨国合作是不是促使学生更多以情感的真实来组织影片，而不是以空间或者时间的连续性来组织影片？
我想这个问题呢，待会儿也请 Pablo 教授再做一些补充哈。我觉得在这个整个的指导过程中呢，Pablo 教授对学生的剪辑有过非常精准的和非常具体的指导。那么我个人认为呢，的确是这样的，因为刚才谈到，因为没有办法在同一个空间里一起拍摄，而是两国的学生各自在自己的国家、各自不同的空间进行拍摄。那么他的这个故事的内容啊，包括这个整个的影片的素材是有很大差异的。那么能够连接这样两部分素材的唯一的方式，当然就是人物的情感。所以情感的连接必然是剪辑的一个核心的前提和准则。谢谢。
So I will talk about this, and I welcome Professor Pablo to provide his insight as well, because during the students' work, you have provided a lot of concrete instruction regarding the how to editing the film so that the product can be even more better. Since the students were not filming in the same space in the same time, there are some differences between the content they choose, between the elements they selected. However, because of these differences, they have to connect with some common things. So the common theme is the emotion among human beings. So because of this, the human beings or emotions become the bridge to connect the students' contents and elements of what they were putting into the product.
And then, Pablo, did you want to add anything to this conversation?
Yeah, Mark Harris told me after this semester in 2020 that when he designed the Global Exchange in 2005, he felt that we had finally achieved his original goal. Now, that was a surprise because I thought we were operating under difficult conditions. But I think what he meant was that when we traveled back and forth, there was always one group that was the host group and the other that was the guest group. And that meant it took a while for the guest group to become accommodated, and they relied a lot on the hosting students and faculty. When it's virtual, that disappeared. There were no hosts and guests. We were all makers. And it meant that we had to cross-cut stories. We had to tell one story for a few seconds, maybe a minute, and then tell another. So it inherently had that relationship question in the editing of the material. Now, as soon as you start cross-cutting, the stories get much more interesting. They're not particularly linear, but they're much more emotional. And in that way, when you start cross-cutting, you reach for one of the highest forms of expression, visual, verbal, which is metaphor. So that you're not saying this is this and that is that. You're saying this is that. This is something else. This is bigger than any one of the elements of the story that you're telling. So I think we were perhaps not intentionally at first, but we found ourselves in an opportunity to tell much grander and much more effective stories than we ever had.
So let's continue in the realm of storytelling. And in the chapter, you introduce the idea of meta stories, where parallel narratives across nations generate a larger intertextual meaning. Do you see this, Pablo, as a structural innovation that emerged specifically because of virtual exchange?
Yes. I went back to doing it once in person, 2004, and then we were Chinese students came to the USC, and then 2005 we went back. And I found that it became, first of all, much more a guest host, and it was really hard for the guests to be active partners, especially because the world had changed so much since the last time we were doing this in person. In 2018, when we last did it in person, there was an openness between nations, and that had disappeared.
Mhm.
And there was a bit of suspicion and a much more careful awareness of what was going into these films. Well, filmmakers don't like operating under restrictions. We like operating under freedom. We like operating with a sense of connection and understanding and empathy and research and investigation. So I am not confident that we'll be able to continue that in person. I think there are some benefits to continuing it online. The problem is, it's just not as sexy online. It's we were all online much too much between 2020 and 2022. It's not really living. And now our lives are constantly mediated by screens. So there's a human desire to get out into the world and see other people and talk to them in person. So I'm not confident what's going to happen to this program with all of the advances that we've had so far.
Yeah, and I'm seeing more, particularly 18 and 19-year-olds that are now wanting to connect. They're wanting to become more analog, which is great as far as I'm concerned. Let's continue in terms of documentary as a form of inquiry, and this question is for Lee. In your discussion of critical making and research creation, you suggest that documentary production becomes a form of inquiry, where students enter urban space as researchers, reflecting on positionality and ethics. And at what point did you recognize that this workshop was reshaping documentary pedagogy itself?
那这个问题是给李教授的，在讨论批判性创作和研究创作的当中呢，您建议到教育纪录片创作本身就是一种探究方式。学生在拍摄当中，作为研究者进入城市空间，反思他们自己的位置和伦理责任。你们是从什么时候开始意识到这个研讨会实际上是正在重塑纪录片的教学方式？
应该说是在这个城市交响的项目的整个的建立的之初，我们这个项目的定位者呢，就是有这样的一个意识的，因为纪录片的本身它就有这个 调查研究的功能嘛。它在制作一个影片的同时，它其实本身实现了一个研究的功能。那所以说呢，在这个整个这个项目的实施过程中呢，无论是在线下的教学，还是在这个通过虚拟的方式，让两国学生在共同的这个完成合作。那么其实呢，我们都也一直是认为，探索就是让学生作为一个研究者进入到一个城市的空间去进行发现和探索，始终是一种非常有效的制作纪录片的一种好的出发点。
So, in fact, at the very beginning of the establishment of this project, the Global City Symphony, we have already had this vision. Through the investigation, research, doesn't matter if it happened in person, offline, or virtual exchange, the students are expected to collaborate and jointly produce the documentary film so that in the process they explore, they discover, they enter the urban space and they reflect and think about who they are.
Thank you. And as we wrap up, we all know that we're living in incredibly challenging times. And so I'd like to ask the last question to both of you. So let's start with Pablo. Toward the end of the chapter, you suggest that virtual exchange can shorten psychological distance between nations and perhaps foster a shared sense of global citizenship. And after living through this experiment, do you believe collaborative documentary practice can meaningfully shift how young filmmakers understand their role in a divided world?
I do. And I do because I believe we're at a pivotal moment now on the earth.
Yep.
And I think that I call it, like Joanna Macy, the environmentalist, called it the great turning, which is in opposition to the great unraveling. And the great turning is one where we reestablish as humans relationships to the planet. And that means ecologically, politically, culturally, and with a shared humanity. And I think that if we can apply what we've learned through these virtual exchanges to the essential topics of our time, I think it can feed into a future in which there's greater understanding and less division and less conflict. So I'm hopeful. The question is, can we survive? And there's a lot of belief that we are nearing the end. And by that, I mean that there are less democracies around the world than ever. There's more pollution in the US. We've abolished the Environmental Protection Agency. A lot of educational programs and health programs are being cut. So at a certain point, we'll hit bottom. And then we have to reconnect with each other, look again at what's the value of education and government, and pull us into a new era where we have greater respect for each other and a greater sustaining of global collaboration.
That's great. And it troubles me that that's so challenging in the world that we live in now. I'd love to throw the same question over to Lee.
那李教授他也邀请您谈谈您的看法，就是在您的那个章节的结尾部分，你们提到虚拟交流能够缩短国家之间的心理距离，甚至可能推动一种共同的全球公民意识。那在经历了整个合作之后，您觉得共同创作纪录片真的能改变年轻的创作者对自己在这个分裂的世界当中的角色的理解吗？
是的，是的，我对这种合作形式的意义，我是做非常积极的判断的。因为前面已经谈到过，没有其他的任何一种形式能像这样一种合作方式一样，能够让两国的学生真正的在理解自己的同时理解对方。包括故事片，包括其他类型的这个形式都做不到这一点。所以我认为呢，这样一种虚拟的合作方式呢，它真正是打造了一个 非常有深远意义的教学的方式。谢谢。
Yes, I believe so. I think the meaningful collaboration among the students had very positive and sustainable impact. They reached the impact that all the other formats cannot reach. For example, the students have to develop some self-awareness, and they also developed the understanding, a better understanding of others. And through the virtual exchange, it truly helped the students to reach this goal.
Do either of you have any last thoughts?
Philosophers from many cultures share the belief that emotion has the power to heal. Shongyang Trungpa Rinpoche, the Tibetan Buddhist teacher, wrote, "If you search for awakened heart, if you put your hand through your rib cage and feel for it, there is nothing there except tenderness. It is this tender heart of a warrior that has the power to heal the world."
Thank you. Thank you. And Lee, do you have any last words before we wrap it up?
那李教授，您还有什么希望跟大家分享的？
我最后就想说的是，这样的一个虚拟的教学的方式呢，我还是强调它的意义是非常的深远的。希望这种形式能够得到更好的推广。
So I would like to emphasize the meaningful and sustainable function of the virtual exchange, and hope more people will get to know about virtual exchange and will be able to implement it.
Thank you both for this work and for sharing your insights. And your chapter offers a powerful reminder that even in moments of profound separation, collaborative storytelling can generate connection, reflection, and possibility. And in doing so, it suggests that virtual exchange is not simply about access or technology, but about cultivating the habits of mind and heart that global citizenship requires. So I want to thank all three of you for being part of this podcast. Thank you so much.